Welcome back. You're listening to Ask the CIO, sponsored by Blackboard on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today, Dr. Gladys Bergoni, the Chief Learning Officer for the U.S. Coast Guard, and Brian Burns, the Deputy CIO, also with the U.S. Coast Guard. Before break, we were talking about technology. Brian laid out his priorities. He laid out some of the technology modernization efforts. I want to go to another piece, though, because part of the readiness piece, which was a major priority for the Commandant, is this idea of personalized learning. I think that's a trend we're starting to see in the education community. So Gladys, start with how are you offering that perspective or that opportunity for someone to say, I'm here today and this is where I want to be in 5 years and here's where I want to be in 10 years. How do they personalize it?
Sure. So Jason, I mentioned earlier, remember the culinary specialist, right? So as an example, right? So we are actually taking that to heart. We're looking to see if individuals, when they're coming to our service or are already in the service, right, who want to join one of our, we have 19 technical fields ratings for enlisted, right? If you want to become, again, a boatswain's mate, those individuals that are right, the ships, right, or the boats that are doing that in the so if they already had, for instance, or their qualifications they were in the Coast Guard, so those individuals now will be able to jump ahead and from what used to be a long school, right, so we've been able to reduce that now by 20%, the training for it, so that individual can get quickly that certification and go out back to the field. And another thing that we're doing is, particularly in our aviation field, one of our training centers, every one of our training centers is really looking at how do we do this blended, right? How do we look at that individual and personalize it? So one of the things that we're doing is called the Rating Apprentice program. So what that does is, let's say you want to become an avionics electrical technician, right? And where that individual, a huge job, right? That individual is going to be working in anything, whether it's the systems, navigations, anything electrical in that aircraft. So that individual typically went to school for 26 weeks. So instead of now going to 26 weeks, we're letting that individual potentially partner with a mentor at an air station. And now they're getting some on-the-job training in advance. They're doing some online learning, right? And by doing that, we've been able, that individual now gets to skip 10 weeks of that training, right? So we've reduced that by that much, which is really, really a great news story for our service. And our goal would be is if we can take a look at more of that mentoring, coaching, just like Brian mentioned, for us to be able to personalize to that individual, we would love to be able to do that. And I see that for our vision in the future, we'll have that opportunity to do so.
Now, you mentioned the one example of the aviation training, but this could mean for anybody, because as soon as they get that hands-on experience, the mentoring, the internship, if you will,
Yes.
that's the difference. But they still need to pass tests. They still need to prove that they know what they need to know.
Absolutely, absolutely. And our review so far is that the individuals are really, really liking it because they are already working with somebody. They're having their hands on that aircraft, being able to fix it before they actually get to the training, the formal training per se. So it's really a win-win.
Brian, I want to bring you back in the conversation because a lot of what Gladys is talking about is really a data-driven exercise. Do you have the right people? Do they have the right skill sets? And then what skill sets are they needed today, but what they also need in the future? So how are you all providing the data tools, the analytic capabilities for people like Gladys to understand what's going on across the community?
So I think that, first of all, let's start with some fundamental concepts. The information belongs to the enterprise. So it's about information. It's not necessarily about the information technology. The other thing is we have to provide information anywhere, anytime, either in a full, a disconnected, an intermittent, or limited environment or networked environment. So we have to design our systems around that. And then we have to provide the capabilities to access that information. And then we have to provide the learning to go with that. So right now we do have a series of data analysts and scientists that are using business intelligence tools today to data mine information. And that's working pretty well. And that gets into a lot of this area itself in terms of what are the learning needs, what are the workforce plans that go forward. But as we go forward with this, we really need to start engaging artificial intelligence and the machine learning capabilities, because at a point it's going to be, we'd have to hire a large volume of analysts versus, so to speak, hiring an AI bot capability to do a lot of this capability for us. So one of the other things that we've kicked off within the Coast Guard is the Data Readiness Task Force, and they're specifically looking at that. How do we better manage our data, both from a traditional standpoint, a big data standpoint, AI moving forward, putting in the ethical algorithms that we're going to need to support that moving forward. And that's going to help drive it. Because at the end of the day, not only, as you mentioned, about personalizing the curriculum, but we actually have right now 5 workforces. We have military active duty, we have military reservists, we have auxiliary members that are volunteers, we have civilians, and we have contractors. As we move into 2030 and 2040, we need to take AI as a tool to help those individuals. But the question that I would ask is, by 2030 or 2040, is AI the 6th workforce that we're going to be dealing with as we go forward? And then as we do that, then a lot of the positions and jobs we have today will change as that, quote, 6th workforce comes on board. The learning will have to change to go with that, because it'll be different jobs that people will be performing.
And Brian, we're just about out of time, but from a data readiness task force, are they looking at not just what the data is today, but what tools you need in the future? Is that something, I imagine we could have a whole conversation about data, but just real briefly, what's their charge for the short term?
Well, it's all of the above. Well, how do we better analyze the data today? What tool sets do we need in the future? How do we organize around the data, and how do we organize as to support that and do the analytics moving forward? So there's multiple phases to the task force to look at those capabilities.
All right, and Gladys, finally, I'm going to give you the last word. What's the big takeaway from our conversation today? What should people know about what the Coast Guard is doing when it comes to learning, teaching, educating civilians, Coast Guard men and women?
I'd say the number one thing is that we really are listening to our workforce, right, and modernizing and being able to produce that learning and training that really best meets their needs, so that we can better support our 11 missions in the Coast Guard in our service. Thank you.
Excellent. Now, this was a great conversation. I very much enjoyed it, but unfortunately, we are out of time for today. Let me thank my guests. Dr. Gladys Brignoni is the Chief Learning Officer and the Director of Force Readiness Command at the U.S. Coast Guard. Gladys, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you so much.
And Brian Burns is the Deputy Assistant Commandant for Command, Control, Communications, and Computers and IT, C4IT, and the Deputy Chief Information Officer, also at the U.S. Coast Guard. Brian, always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you. And I'd just like to say our people are our #1 asset in the U.S. Coast Guard.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to Ask the CIO, sponsored by Blackboard on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Ask the CIO.